All right, welcome everybody. I think any latecomers can join. In the meantime, we should begin. My name is Sohela Surajpal, and I am currently completing my master's at the Center for Human Rights in Human Rights and Democratization in Africa. I'm really excited to be moderating this discussion today, which is going to be focusing largely on issues of local government. In South Africa specifically, our constitution establishes 3 spheres of government: national, provincial, and local, all of which play really, really important roles. Unfortunately, local government doesn't receive quite the same level of attention, especially in terms of elections, that national and provincial elections do. But we think that it's really important to be having these kinds of conversations about local government, especially given the very real impact that they have on service delivery, on the quality of lives that people have on the ground. And we think in a South African context, it's a really interesting conversation to be having because of what happened with our 2016 local elections, which resulted in a number of hung legislatures of coalition governments. And given that upcoming by-elections and local elections are just around the corner. And so we think it's a very important issue to be discussing, and to help us wrap our minds around some of the important contexts and concepts at play, we have 2 incredible panelists. Bonolo is the program manager at the Democracy and Civic Engagement Unit at the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. And Bonolo is an electoral systems researcher at My Vote Counts, and also has her master's in politics and international relations from the University of Johannesburg. We're really privileged and pleased to have you both here, and we're sure that you're going to share some really, really important insights with all of us today. Before I hand over to Bonolo, I just want to ask, as sort of ground rules, that everyone except the panelists, please make sure that your microphone is switched off. And if you don't mind your camera as well, we find that generally these things work a little better if everyone's camera and mic are off. If you have any questions or any comments during the course of the session, please feel free to write them in the comment section. And at the end of our speakers' time, we'll go back and address some of those questions and concerns. So Bonolo is going to be speaking to us a little bit about the idea of coalition government, especially. She's going to talk us through a case study of the Johannesburg municipal elections, which resulted in a coalition government that has sort of fallen apart. And she's going to be speaking to us especially about the future of this coalition government, given the COVID-19 pandemic and how that's affected governance. Bonolo, please take the floor.
Thank you, Sohela. Good afternoon, everyone. Good to have you back. Thank you, Sohela, for the introduction. So I have a particular interest in South African politics. I always say that I am the almost displaced non-lawyer person at the Center for Human Rights. I'm a political scientist, and I work for a human rights organization. So I always get excited when I have to talk about politics, particularly South African politics, because I have a passion in politics, and specifically I'm invested in the South African politics with a keen interest in local government. So I'm going to be reflecting on what coalition means and what it looks like within the South African context, and particularly make some reflections on the previous administration of the Johannesburg Municipality, the DA-led coalition, and where we are now with the ANC, and make some, predictions of what 2021 would look like, especially with the impact of COVID-19 and how the African National Congress has responded to COVID-19. So a historical reflection In 2016, the 2016 local government elections were a turning point for South African politics. This moment dramatically changed the political landscape of a country that had one party, the African National Congress, with a complete electoral dominance and power. Post the 2016 elections, the ANC lost the country's capital city, Tshwane. For those of you who are not South African, Tshwane is Pretoria. They lost the economic hub, Johannesburg, and they lost the Nelson Mandela Bay in Port Elizabeth, and only managed to maintain power in eThekwini, and that's Durban, for those of you who aren't South African. Opposition parties in the 3 hung municipalities joined forces to unseat the ANC and proceeded to vote in the DA mayors in Tshwane, Johannesburg, and Nelson Mandela Bay constituencies. So now we see South Africa finding itself in an exciting and equally yet turbulent space as coalition develops to open way for hung municipalities. Excuse me, these election results came with an unprecedented wave. No party had 50+1 majority of votes to govern Johannesburg Municipality. And according to the IEC, the ANC over the years maintained 60% voter support since the first local government election held in 1995. And for the first time, the ANC experienced an 8% decline of electoral support at the 2016 local government elections. And prior to the elections, some projections suggested that the ANC support actually was even less than 56%. And someone once argued that South African democracy has been uncommon democracy, considering the fact that there's one party that owned the electoral dominance and power. And perhaps the 2016 local government electoral outcomes marked the beginning of the correction of this uncommon democracy, if you may. However, in October 2019, I remember this day very well. I had just traveled from the Gambia and I landed back in South Africa to the news that Herman Mashaba, who was the then mayor of the city of Johannesburg, has resigned. And not only did he resign as the Democratic Alliance member and leader, but he resigned as the mayor of the Johannesburg Municipality. And subsequently, a new mayor was elected, and the ANC had majority votes and claimed back the Johannesburg Municipality. The ANC won a seat in the legislature with about 137 votes, followed by the DA, which was sitting at about 101, and the EFF with about 30 votes. Now, the ANC took back the Johannesburg Municipality, which they lost after the 2021 government elections. But following this change, there was a turbulent shift in the political alliances within the council in the Johannesburg Municipality, where some smaller parties that had supported the DA as the leading party with the previous administration abandoned the coalition and sided with the ANC. And therefore, the ANC ended up holding a majority membership within the council, and resulted in the ANC, Jeff Makuba, being elected as the new mayor of Johannesburg Municipality. And of course, the EFF and the DA became the official opposition within the Johannesburg Municipality governance framework. Now, having given this background, I quickly want to do a brief academic reflection on the rationale around coalition formation. Tradition has shown that the formation of coalition government can be seen primarily as an act of political expediency. So the statement on its own underscores the reality that given the choice, political parties will not consider forming coalition governments. If coalition formation involves a process which leads to power sharing, as well as the material benefits that accompany it, then by deduction, coalition formation is a process which normally occurs because neither or none of the cooperating parties can manage to win elections on their own and govern on its own voters' constituency. Academic literature highlights that global evidence of coalition politics in particular shows that it is an incredibly complex and difficult political art to manage. It further suggests that the survival of coalition politics will require a range of expertise and skills to manage the undeniable and inevitable power dynamics as political rivals are forced to become allies. And that's what was happening in the city of Johannesburg when the DA was leading the administration. You saw multiple party battles with a lot of political ideological clashes, because here's different parties with different political ideologies, with different political manifestos and agendas being forced into this, I call it a marriage of convenience, because they had no choice. One, none of them won the majority votes that they required to govern the city, but two, with a common goal to unseat the African National Congress. Now, the constant pressure for political parties to maintain their independence and autonomy in the eyes of their voters while being forced to collaborate with their competition requires an impeccable set of skills, clear terms of reference, and regulatory mechanism. And just on this point, one of the things that led to the collapse of the previous municipal coalition government was exactly that the coalition government did not intentionally develop coalition agreement with clear terms of reference and clear regulatory mechanism, particularly on how to manage conflicts that inevitably comes to the surface, considering that these are political parties with different political ideologies. And therefore, the idea of a coalition government being formed to maximize power and equally for policy objective, it's almost inconceivable. Political parties' main objectives is to win governing power and serve their constituencies. Each political party is indebted to its voters to ensure that it honors the promises that it made during their election campaign and has a constitutional obligation to deliver on that mandate. But also beyond maximizing power to serve its constituencies, political parties form coalitions to unseat an incumbent ruling party, which was essentially the case in the city of Johannesburg in the DA-led coalition government. And so this action is usually motivated by various reasons, which include corruption. You would want to unseat the incumbent party because of corruption, questionable governance, absence of rule of law, and lack of service delivery, of which these were the case. The common offering in the South African public domain and political conversation was that South African citizens struggled in particular with corruption allegations around President Jacob Zuma. But further to that, lack of service delivery in the city of Johannesburg in particular, issues around housing backlog, issues around good housing policy in particular that works for people that reside within the city and those that live within the periphery of the city, your so-called black townships. And so now that I've given the historical reflection on the formation of coalition governance within the context of the Johannesburg Municipality, and I've given a brief academic reflection on the rationale around the formation of coalition government, I want to get into the conversation around around COVID-19, in particular, because this conversation is around the future of the Johannesburg Municipality coalition government amid COVID-19 and what that will look like for them in the 2021 government elections. So on a national level, it is no doubt that nations have fallen due to consequences of coronavirus and its impact on the global economy, But one of the things that we need to remember is that there's a phase behind the economy. And that's something we shouldn't forget in the South African context. The Black urban and Black rural communities, which are the phase behind the economy, have been most hit hard by the economic shutdown caused by coronavirus. At the start of the national lockdown intended to curb the spread of the coronavirus under the advice of the World Health Organization, the South African government decided to temporarily halt all economic activities. And this was between March, April, May. Things started easing up around July, August, and so forth. And while this was an important and necessary measure, it came with the real everyday consequences for poor people in South Africa. The South African government put in place a temporary employer-employee relief scheme in order to help workers who had been affected by the national lockdown. And this formed part of President Cyril Ramaphosa's 500 million economic social relief package. Now, this plan has been met with numerous challenges, in which include system backlogs as well as unauthorized payments, which have left workers further vulnerable and unable to access this relief that the state had made provision for. The government is thus investigating a large-scale looting from about $26 million coronavirus rescue package, which was intended to assist in the economic impact of the pandemic on struggling households. In fact, the payment of the temporary employer-employee relief system was suspended around September 7th after the release of an Auditor General report, which uncovered alleged fraud and irregularities in the system. And so South African citizens are saying, we've seen corruption over the years in the ANC governance. But corruption during a global pandemic, really the ANC? And so not only that, additionally, shock and frustration from citizens has reached an all-time high when it emerged a few weeks ago that members of the political elite have enriched themselves at the expense of mostly COVID-affected societies, having dipped into COVID-19 social grant. This relief grant, which consisted about the 350 stipend, was unfortunately lost through frightful misuse. Again, the National Treasury reported the spending of 500 billion rands, which is about 26 billion US dollars, which was allocated towards COVID-19 relief and represented the equivalent of 10% of the country's gross domestic product. Again, we've seen corruption in the country, but during a global pandemic, we still see the political elite continuing to take from provision made for the poor. And that's on national level. But on the city of Johannesburg in particular, in the past couple of days, about 10 days or so, a report came out with allegations of tender fraud regarding PPE contracts of 80 million spent just in 15 days. The DA argues that this 80 million tender fraud was the tip of the iceberg. Preliminary reports from internal audits put total expenditure at more than 600 million as of July 17th, of which over 400 million, which is about 70%, has been flagged as highly suspicious. 70% of what had been allocated for PPE in the Johannesburg Municipality. In fact, if you think about it, they, within a period of 15 days, the Johannesburg Municipality spent about 15 times more than the actual cost of PPEs. So that's one. That's something to think about, that the electorate is now engaging with the state. They're engaging with the ANC government on a national level and corruption allegations that are coming. And now they're also engaging with what is happening in the city of Johannesburg. on corruption associated to COVID-19. But not only that, we have seen, and this might slightly be outside of the COVID-19 perspective, we have seen, following the reassumption of the ANC over the city of Johannesburg Municipality, municipal residents have been subjected to increased electricity bills in the face of the lacking address of service delivery, particularly around, as I noted earlier, particularly around housing backlog. The city of Johannesburg has seen an immense housing backlog for over the years, and both the previous administration and the current administration have not been able to resolve this serious housing backlog. And therefore, you find South African, or rather citizens of the Johannesburg municipality occupying land illegally, which was actually one of the contentious issues between the DA and the EFF, where the DA deemed that as an illegal act, and the ANC and the EFF said, if there's an open space and the city is not providing housing for its citizens, then citizens must occupy the land illegally. So there's been issues around service delivery. We've seen numerous service delivery protests, particularly within the city of Johannesburg. But an interesting one as well, which I think I should flag, is the political ideological differences, which I mentioned earlier. In comparison with the previous administration, we tend to see that the ANC ideologies do not lean away from other parties in the same way as the DA and the EFF did. Minor policy issues in comparison to the EFF and the DA, which of course ultimately led to the collapse of the coalition. So it's an interesting thing to note that in this municipality, in this coalition government in particular, there has not been very strong political ideological differences, but there have been minor policy issues. So at the moment, the IFP actually is in some battle with the ANC around policy issues. And of course, I think it's important to also note an opportunity that has been presented here, considering that the body politics of South Africa is evolving. Coalition politics and coalition formation provide an opportunity for medium and smaller political parties to take part in governance. In the same vein, this provides an opportunity for these medium to small parties to create public profile and use disproportionate influence to gain voting powers to participate in government. And we saw that when the ANC then took over the municipality, smaller parties abandoned the DA and went with the ANC because it gives them an opportunity for them to be part of the governance, even with their disproportionate number of representation. Just before I get into the 2021 elections, I think it's important to note that in the 2016 local government elections in particular, we saw a considerable decline of the ANC support between 2006 and 2016. It has been reported that there was a loss of about approximately 20% decline. And not only did we see that on local government elections, we saw that last year in the 2019 national government elections, where the National Assembly elections was won by the ruling party, the ANC, but with a reduced majority of 57.50%, down from the 62.15% that they enjoyed in the 2014 elections. Now, as I conclude, I want to ask a question. Before I get there, so in that moment in the 2019 elections, this was also ANC's lowest vote share since the election after the end of apartheid in 1994. And there are various reasons here to why we've seen a voter decline for the ANC in particular. And Nobuhle noted as well in the previous session that there's also been a significant voter turnout decline, particularly young South Africans aren't voting because they are struggling with the way things are. But I want to ask a question before I conclude, in light of what I noted in terms of COVID-19 and corruption allegations associated with the ANC national government and the Johannesburg Municipality government. That will history repeat itself in 2021? There was multiple factors offered in the public domain that explained this drastic decline of ANC voters. And I've highlighted this: corruption, controversy surrounding President Jacob Zuma, questionable governance, service delivery, high rate of unemployment, especially among young people, have significantly contributed to the ANC loss of electoral dominance. In the 2016 coalition politics, coalition politics were born as a result of community concerns, as I've mentioned. Now, specifically considering that, the ANC did not claim the Johannesburg Municipality based on electoral support. They claimed the municipality last year, October, one, because of the resignation of Herman Mashaba, but two, of course, because of the tension between the ANC, the DA, and the EFF, which ultimately led to the collapse of the coalition government. I'm now arguing that what happened in 2016 with the ANC losing electoral support because of corruption associated with President Jacob Zuma, a lack of service delivery, and so on and so forth, we might see this pattern be repeated, considering the fact that the ANC is not currently ruling Johannesburg Municipality because they may have claimed back the support of the electorate because they won back the municipality because of the votes that were done in the legislative house. Now, South African citizens are paying attention. South African citizens are paying attention to the state. South African citizens are actively engaging with the state, and they're paying attention to questionable governance of the African National Congress. And I'm wondering if the ANC is actually paying attention, because if the ANC was paying attention, then we wouldn't be seeing what we have seen in the past couple of months when political elites are dipping their hands into provisions made by the president to respond to COVID-19. If the ANC was paying attention, what we see happening in the Johannesburg municipality, we wouldn't have seen it happen. So I suggest, and I bring to the table, that perhaps history might repeat itself and the future of the Johannesburg Municipality Coalition is not sustainable. In any case, coalitions themselves are not sustainable. And therefore, if we consider all these other factors around corruption, questionable governance, and lack of service delivery, the electorate might just explore the alternative and not vote for the ANC. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonolo. So I think that as much as your presentation spoke a lot to the South African context, ideas around coalition governments are incredibly important to everyone because of the impact that they potentially have on democracy, because of the way that they allow us to challenge dominant parties as smaller parties, but also of the potential harms that come about through ideological compromise and almost a betrayal of some of the values that political parties claim to stand for. And so I'm sure we're going to have a really great discussion with you when we move to some questions and comments. But before we do, we're going to hear from Little Bonolo, who, as I mentioned, is a researcher who focuses on electoral systems. And she's going to be speaking to us today about how COVID-19 has affected the electoral process, looking specifically at South Africa's local elections and by-elections. So Little Bonolo, we're really keen to hear about you, and we're sure that whatever you have to share will be applicable to all of us, regardless of where we come from.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just trying to share my screen. Is it showing, Sohela?
Yes, I see it.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bonolo Makgale. I'm the Electoral Systems researcher at My Vote Counts. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Center for Human Rights for inviting me to this important discussion on harnessing the pandemic to improve the elections. So my presentation today is entitled, How has COVID-19 affected the electoral process? Specifically focusing on the case of South Africa's by-elections and local government elections. The COVID-19 pandemic has impacted every aspect of our society and of course changed the electoral landscape insofar as the scheduling of elections is concerned. So this is speaking to elections having to be postponed and other countries, some of them being cancelled. And while you had countries such as Tanzania, Malawi, and Burundi and so forth that had elections during the pandemic. So now the question was whether how has COVID-19 affected whether the elections would have been free, fair, and transparent. So just a brief overview of the situation in South Africa. Initially, the Independent Electoral Commission postponed the municipal by-elections and voter registration activities in a bid to reduce the spread of the coronavirus. The reason for this topic in particular is that elections are a key instrument of democracy, and local government in particular, elections in particular are one of the most important platforms where South Africans choose the candidates of their choice to serve as elected councillors in local municipalities. I'll expand on this point as I go along. So the broad question is, how has COVID-19 affected the electoral process? So just give a context of how COVID-19 played out in South Africa and how elections were kind of affected. By March, the virus had already spread to over 200 countries, so changing the face of elections. So South Africa was no exception at the time. So in response to the pandemic and government implementation of the lockdown to obviously curb the spread of the virus, the Electoral Court postponed all the scheduled by-elections that were scheduled for March, April, and May, along with the associated activities, including the voters registration. You would know that the voter registration happens a few weeks before the actual by-election. So all of that process that makes part of the by-election process were put on hold. So just a brief explanation of what the Electoral Court is. It's a specialist court established by Parliament dedicated to matters relating to elections and the oversight of the Electoral Commission. So there's a body that kind of oversees matters that relate to elections in South Africa. So where there's issue of electoral misconduct, the rigging of elections, the first point of call is usually the Electoral Court, and then the matter proceeds accordingly in the hierarchy of the judiciary in the country. So the Electoral Court granted the IEC an extension beyond the window period for by-elections that were affected by COVID-19. What I mean by the window period is that when election is, for instance, scheduled for the 15th of March, the window period is 90 days. So you can still have that election. So between March, April, May, and June. So that's 3 months that you can still have the election. So even if the previous mandate expires on the 15th of March, you still have 90 days to have an election and vote a new council into office. So that's the 90-day period. So even though the date was beyond the 90-day period, that's where the Electoral Court came in and said elections can still be postponed further than that 90-day period. I think it's worth explaining a bit the electoral system as far as the local government elections are concerned, because there's a bit of a difference between how local government is elected into power and versus how the National Provincial Assembly is voted into power, and that kind of explains the importance of the local government elections in the context of COVID and in the context of South Africa as a whole. So the Constitution of South Africa prescribes a proportional representation, that is the PR electoral system for the National and Provincial Assembly and for municipalities. But however, for municipalities, it gives two options, which is a mixed or hybrid system, making use of both the ward and the PR systems. So there are three types of municipal councils in South Africa, depending on their location. So that is the category A is the metropolitan municipalities, category B the local municipalities, and C the district municipalities. So when you speak about a hybrid, or where you use a PR, you get 40% of local council is derived from proportional representations through the party list, and you have the 60% of the local council that is derived from the ward system, where the people actually vote directly for their ward. So you can understand now that local government are critical in the sense that they provide the closest form of direct democracy at a very, very crucial level, which is the local government. So what is a by-election? A by-election is an election that takes place in a ward in a municipality in between general municipal elections. A by-election must be held if the candidates, a by-election must be held if, the Electoral Commission does declare the results of the elections a municipal council or in a ward within a specified period. A court sets aside the election of a council or a ward, or the council is dissolved. I think this kind of speaks to what Bonolo was speaking about when a mayor would resign, and then there would be coalition politics where a certain council is dissolved. So you get people who kind of relinquish their seats. So you have a situation where there is a ward, a ward that does not have a councillor, so that when you you might want to have an emergency by-election. So those are some of the circumstances that lead to by-elections, or the death of a ward councillor. Okay, the resignation of a ward councillor from a party or municipal council, had said, or in the case of the expulsion of a ward councillor from a party or municipality. These is some of the legislative framework that governs local government elections. I'm not going to waste time going through them. I think you can have a look at them during your spare time. So these are kind of the legislative that drive the local government elections. I think what I also wanted to focus on was the amendments of these legislation ahead of the 2021 elections. So that's the reason why I had the legislative framework. So there has been some amendments to the electoral legislation ahead of the 2021 local government elections. I think this is important now because you are going to have quite a few factors at play with regards to the election next year. You have this global pandemic that has affected the elections, and you have certain changes or amendments to the legislation. And I think one that I would also want to flag is some amendments to the voters' roll with regards to some of the information being removed. This is the information of registered voters being removed from the voters' roll. There's currently an amendment bill being going on, so we have to give in some comments for that. So I'm actually quite still busy with that, giving our comments to the amendment bills, whether we agree or disagree with these amendments. So this is an example of the amendments that are in place, and of course you would know of the judgment regarding the independent candidates as well, which now allows for independent candidates to also please excuse me, for independent candidates to also be able to stand for elections. So I think I'm bringing this to the fore in a sense that because now these are the key factors that are going to be at play in these elections. So you have COVID, you have independent candidates coming in, you have amendments to the electoral legislation. I think my colleagues earlier did speak up about the historical overview of the local government elections, but I'll just read through. The first local government elections took place in 1995 and 1996 under the new dispensation following the historical national elections in 1994. While the elections were officially held in 1995, due to demarcation disputes, I think Nobuhle Elia mentioned the issues with the former homeland, Bophuthatswana, and so forth. So these issues also led to some of the elections only taking place in 1996. The second elections were in 2000, and the third ones were in 2006. So I think I'll focus on these because these elections were characterized by service delivery protest at the municipal level. Riots and sporadic protests had broken out before the elections, and also related to the issue of service delivery was dysfunctional municipalities and lack of accountability of councillors were cited as major stumbling blocks to functional local governments. So in 2006, I'd call it maybe the realization of people, of the citizens, of being able to stand up and say, you know what, this local government is not really working for us. So between 1995 to 2006, the elections were relatively peaceful. But beginning of 2006, that's when people realized the power that they have at local governments to decide local government. That's when you started seeing protests against poor service delivery at the local level. So we had the fourth local government elections in 2011. Though the elections were generally peaceful, again, issues of service delivery, corruption, healthcare, poverty, and unemployment were prominent. So now we're establishing a pattern to kind of explain where we are in terms of the trajectory of local government elections in South Africa. The fifth local government elections were in 2016. Now, these were a critical turning point in South Africa's political history. I mean, the ruling ANC lost control of 3 municipalities, and Bonolo mentioned them and kind of gave context to the issues that were prevalent at the time. So you also have an element of the dominance of the ANC being challenged, while coalition and minority governments becoming the order of the day. I think Bonolo really covered this section well. So conceptual consideration, just to kind of give the paper or the research a bit of a framework in which to kind of lynch on. I think the whole paper or the whole topic is centered around elections and democracy. We have COVID-19, we have these changes in the legislations, we have these protests against service delivery. But again, what is that thing that's holding together what we're talking about? So it's elections. So how I defined elections in this paper is that elections are a key feature of democracy and a critical component of building societies. Elections provide the mechanism through which political leaders are chosen and held to account, and through which individuals participate in the governance of their country. Therefore, elections serve as the means of granting legitimacy and authority to elected leaders in a democratic systems. So what is democracy? Democracy is a political system where the elected representatives are accountable to the electorate, and the elections are the mechanism through which accountability is enforced. Democracy is a system of governance that allows citizens to participate in political power through elected representatives. So just getting into the crux of the topic and the research. So what are the complexities of by-elections and local government elections in the context of COVID-19? Obviously, in the context of South Africa, and with regards to by-elections and local government elections, because that's where we are in terms of elections, this electoral cycle in South Africa. So the first point of call was the postponement of local government elections due to COVID-19. This came about where other countries decided to postpone elections due to COVID-19. But I mean, the first challenge that came with this avenue, or rather this alternative to the pandemic, was that postponing without building consensus with political opposition on such decisions, you would have concerns around the motives of buying time, as like for the incumbent, or prolonged tenure for already unpopular leaders, or those whose mandates may be ending soon, of which is the case. So what transpired? the African National Congress and the Economic Freedom Fighters called for the postponement of the upcoming government elections. Those political parties maintained that going ahead with the election during a pandemic could interfere with the electoral process, including the way political parties develop their campaigns and the demarcation of wards, which was delayed by the pandemic. Please excuse me. However, other parties, including the Democratic Alliance, the Freedom Front Plus, Congress of the People, and the Inkatha Freedom Party, rejected any postponement of the poll beyond the terms of the Constitution. The second alternative that came about was harmonizing the election in response to COVID-19. Again, you had the ANC and the EFF calling for the synchronization of the national, provincial, and local government elections and as an alternative for delaying the poll due to COVID-19. So for people who are outside of South Africa, we have different elections. So we have national and provincial elections that run concurrently for a 5 year cycle, and then we have local government that run 2 years later, also for a 5 year period. So we don't have harmonized elections in South Africa. So this was a call to have harmonized elections. So the synchronization of elections became part of a discussion on how South Africa could and should reform because of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the challenge came about in that, according to the IEC, the decision to synchronize municipal and provincial and national elections can only happen after next year's local government polls. That is, the decision to merge the election rested with Parliament. A key challenge to merging the elections would be around timeframes. I mean, political parties in the National and Provincial Assembly are currently elected until 2024. If a local government is elected next year, it would not coincide. So these are the challenges that I was alluding to earlier, that there are already electoral cycles that are in place. So what happens now? Local government elections are likely to go ahead despite COVID-19? Question mark. By-elections have been scheduled to take place on November 11. My colleagues have been alluding to this throughout the sessions. So this looks like a clear indication that local government elections might go ahead. But then it's worth noting, well, that elections during a pandemic will also present a plethora of challenges. You know, elections become opportunities for the spread of the virus. So these are some of the challenges that we might want to get ahead of. You know, conducting elections during a pandemic could also result in the public debate only focusing on the current public health crisis, thereby preventing a wider discussion about other important topics. And I really see this happening because, you know, local government elections have always been characterized by issues of service delivery with regards to education, healthcare. You know, those really primary socio-economic issues that affect people at the local level. So we might have a shift of you know, the concerns and the issues that might need to be addressed because of the prevalence of the pandemic. Another important point is that the pandemic and measures to contain it may give some leaders rights to oppress political opposition or media freedoms, making elections held under emergency conditions less free and less fair than they should be. I think my colleagues also mentioned the situations in countries that held elections during the pandemic. So just to wrap up the presentation, I mean, I think there's still time for the IEC to kind of sit and decide on the type of elections to be held under the conditions of a pandemic. I think that's the question, that's the debate, that's actually the topic that needs to be, not whether to postpone or not, but to kind of ascertain what type of elections to have. So a suggestion that I had was exploring alternative voting arrangements that can allow elections to take place during a pandemic. I mean, the IEC already has special voting arrangements for the elderly, the disabled or pregnant, or registered voters that cannot vote at the voting station on election day. So these could be modified to kind of suit the context of elections during a pandemic. I mean, special voting arrangements constitute an important safety measure that provides voters with alternative and possible safer ways to vote. These can mitigate the impact of the spread of the virus may have on the voter participation and the availability of election officers to managing voting stations. Yeah, I think I will leave it there, Chair. Thank you so much for allowing me to present my paper.
Thank you so much. I think that you've given us a really excellent overview, not only of South Africa's framework, both legally and politically, regarding local elections, but of the various complexities that arise in organizing elections moving forward, that again, I think are applicable to the great number of African states that are in the process of organizing their elections right now. And so we don't have too much time left, but we would like to address some of the questions that you as the audience have posed, that we might have been thinking about. And so either one of the panelists, feel free to jump in to collaborate, to address any of the questions where you think you have something valuable to contribute. We have a question here from Dr. Rufus Olalua from Nigeria, and he asks, what is the general impact of local politics or local government politics on broader national politics? And I think this is really interesting, perhaps in reference to what you spoke about, Bonolo, in terms of the relationship between declining ANC support at both the local and national level.
Okay, can I answer that question?
Sure.
So there is local government does have an impact on national, and particularly because for citizens, the first point of entry to national politics is on local level. The first entry of encounter and contact with the state is on local government level. So how citizens engage with ward councillors, for example, how citizens engage with the municipality's provision of basic needs, things like water and sanitation, things like proper road infrastructure, things like policing and handling crimes within different points of residence. So now if citizens aren't happy with the lack of service delivery from municipalities on local government level, that will automatically have an impact on how they vote for national government. So local government is the first point of entry in how citizens engage with the body politic of any country, because that's closer to them. So national will set out policies and say, we've allocated this odd number of money for housing provision, we've allocated this odd amount of money for water and sanitation, for example. But that will be implemented by local government on local level. So if local government does not fulfill or rather implement some of the policy provisions and use budget allocated to them from national government level, citizens will have an issue with local government, which will then have an impact on how they vote on a national level, because they measure the service provision of national level based on how local government engages with them.
Thanks so much. I think that's especially relevant in South Africa, where we've had pretty much a dominant political party, and these types of coalition governments, especially at a local level, give people an opportunity to start to engage with alternatives. Perhaps the next question can go to Bonolo. And this is a question about the accusations that we've been hearing coming from the US about potential voter fraud or rigging within the electoral process, given changes that have happened due to the pandemic, things like mail-in ballots and absentee ballots. Do you think that those concerns are valid in a South African context? And what do you think the IEC needs to do to ensure that voters maintain their trust in the electoral process?
Thanks, Sohela. I mean, the IEC has not clearly came out to say that they would be amending the way people vote for next year's local government elections. So that is something that we're still waiting to hear on how we can vote next year or what are the options that are available. So that is not really applicable to the South African context as yet. But I mean, those are things that we might want to look at as pitfalls to kind of moving the way we vote. I mean, my concerns, I think my first concern especially would be the socialization of people. You know, when you change a voting method, I think the most important thing would be civic education. I think it will be such a disservice to people that we wake up, it's next year, it's August, and we're changing the way we vote. I mean, that will definitely impact the voter turnout, you know, and the voter apathy. You know, those are a really serious challenges that we would need to consider. But as far as I know, the IC has not said anything about changing the way we vote, even with the context of COVID-19. So that's something that's on, you know, a wait and hear issue. So yeah, that's my take on the question.
Okay, sure. So it's something we'll perhaps have to address at a later stage. We have another question. I think this one primarily for you, Bonolo, regarding what you mentioned about ideological conflicts and inconsistencies when forming coalition governments. So how does a party being perceived as betraying or at the very least compromising their ideology impact their standpoint, the way that they are perceived by voters? And I'm thinking here especially about the Johannesburg Municipality, where you have Herman Mashaba, who was supported through the coalition by the EFF, even though the DA and Mashaba were very anti-poor, were sort of center-right parties, while the EFF is more of a left-wing party whose voters are working class, are poor, and who disagree very much with much of what Mashaba stands for.
So that's an interesting one. So I'll start off by saying, and I noted this earlier, that ideological differences between the EFF and the DA ultimately led to the collapse of the coalition, right? Because coalitions are notoriously and inherently difficult, often requiring a balancing act between interest parties. And what we saw in particular in the city of Johannesburg, we saw smaller parties that were easily, or rather smaller parties easily reached a compromise and surrendered some of their political ideologies for the success of the coalition. But we saw a constant battle between the EFF and the DA. Now that you mentioned Herman Mashaba, and I think this is what makes this conversation interesting. Herman Mashaba makes an interesting case study, and I'll explain why I say this. There was a surprising form of compromise and a contradictory alliance between Mashaba and the EFF. So we've got Herman Mashaba as an institutional representation of the Democratic Alliance, one. And then we also have him as the leader of the coalition government. And the Democratic Alliance often accused Mashaba of compromising the party's political positions and ideologies in favor of the coalition. And I'll explain why. If you remember, Sohela, when there was the Alexandra shutdown and informal settlement were demolished by the Red Ants, what did Herman Mashaba do? Herman Mashaba went to Alexandra, and keep in mind, they were demolished by the DA. So Herman Mashaba went to Alexandra and said to the citizens of Alexandra that he's going to rebuild their houses. The DA demolished these establishments because they were claiming that Alexandra citizens had occupied the land illegally, and therefore land grab is an act of illegality. But Mashaba, because he may have understood who holds the power behind the throne, and that being the EFF as a queen maker that had voting powers. In some cases, you would see Mashaba agreeing with the EFF at the expense of compromising his own party's ideological differences. And that's something that makes Mashaba interesting if you are to do an institutional, an analysis of a representation of an institution. Because we have him here, and I maintain that if Mashaba did not resign in October last year, the DA was going to get rid of Mashaba, because the DA over and over struggled with the fact that Mashaba was essentially the leader of the coalition government and not necessarily the DA leader, because what he did, he allowed himself to form this contradictory alliance with the EFF in favor of the coalition, because he wanted the coalition to succeed. So essentially he was the mayor of the coalition and not the mayor of the DA. And that's what makes this ideological difference and institutional representation in the person of the leader very interesting. And that's why I constantly keep arguing that Mashaba would have been let go somehow by the DA if he didn't resign, because the DA struggled with him. And the Alexandra case is one example that his party went and demolished Alexandra citizens' houses, or rather informal settlement structures, because they were occupied illegally. Mashaba goes against his party's position to say, we are going to rebuild, because that was the position that the DA held. I mean, the EFF held. And it was a strategic move from his end, because he knew that essentially, if the EFF does not agree with him, they will withdraw their vote and the coalition will collapse.
So I think you've also done a really great job here of answering questions about what drove the coalition to collapse in the first place, but also highlighting one of the possible concerns we can have about coalition governments, which is that parties that don't get a particularly lot of votes, like the EFF, end up becoming, as you put it, queen makers. They start to become the deciding factor that the coalition must pander to in order to maintain power, despite the fact that they don't represent in any way the majority of voters. And that's something that I think we must be very wary of when we think about coalitions. So
can I just come in there
sure.
quickly, Sohela? I think we must remember that the most common rationale for coalition formation is to win elections and to unseat a ruling party that has power, right? And you're right. In the case of the Johannesburg Municipality in particular, these political parties did not join the multi-party government because they wanted to change their policy position or their ideological positions. Their main agenda was to unseat the ANC. So they found themselves in this forced marriage of convenience to unseat the ANC. And you remember when Malema was interviewed right after the agreement of coalition, of course the EFF chose to not join the coalition officially, but sat as queen makers. And that was a very strategic move for them in particular, because it gave them power. But there's something that Malema said, and he said, and I quote, he said, the DA is a better devil. We couldn't be neutral. We had to take sides. We are caught between two devils. So because they were caught between two devils, they then decided who is a better devil. The ANC was obviously not a better devil for them, considering historical relationships between Malema and the ANC. So because the ANC was not a better devil for them, they took a strategic move to vote for the DA. But what they then did was that even at that, and this is why I find that the EFF was very smart and strategic in their move, they knew that if they officially committed to the coalition, they would have taken the power that they may have had. And what they then strategically did was they said, we are going to stand on the margins of this formation and yet with our voting power. And they now are holding everyone ransom. That because if you don't agree with us, we are going to withdraw our powers and the coalition will collapse. Because it was not about ensuring good governance, if you may. It was just about unseating the ANC.
Yeah, no, definitely a very, very strategic move by the EFF. Something perhaps to admire as politicians, but something to be wary of as builders of democracy and protectors of human rights. So I think we are quite a bit over time, but just two more questions and then we can round up. So we have a question here from India around what criteria is used to determine municipalities and local government areas. I think perhaps that this question relates to how we draw up wards and constituencies and make those determinations. Ilokgonolo, do you perhaps have any insight that you could share here?
Hi, Sumida. I'm unable to share the intricacies of how they are demarcated. Perhaps Bonolo could help me out on this one if she knows.
What's the question?
So it's a question about what criteria is used to determine municipalities and other local government areas. And I think it speaks to how constituencies and wards are drawn up.
Sorry, I wouldn't know the details around that. I mean, I would imagine that, for example, with, and I say this under correction, the city of Johannesburg in particular would have over 30 odd wards. And I imagine that it will essentially be geographical locations. So the city as it is, it has the north, the south. So you have the north, which is where the elites are. And then you have the south, if you may, where if you think about the South African spatial arrangement during apartheid government, where the poor were located within the periphery of the city in the name of the uncontributing to the economy and the GDP of the government, right? So if you look at a place like Soweto, for example, which is one of the biggest townships in South Africa, you can have one councillor for the entire Soweto because that's logistically not practical. So how they will then formulate what locations will be based on geographical positions as to what determines what will that look like, the length of how they draw up the ward councillors. I wouldn't know. I think those are some of the things that town planners would be able to answer on. But I think as an offering, I think it's important to remember that the ward councillors are supposed to cater to people within their immediate location and radius, and therefore they will draw them up based on geographical location.
Thank you. I'm also no expert, but I do know that some time ago, a few years ago, there was significant protests by a group of people who didn't want to be part of the municipality or the particular political area that they had been assigned to. It was obviously just after provincial lines and ward lines were drawn up in the time of a new democracy. And so all I want to just add to that is that this is something that has been contested by popular movements, by political actors, as opposed to just being a sort of, I guess, very technical demarcation. Though we have a comment here just saying that there is a particular demarcation act, and so Parliament has sort of addressed this issue if you're interested in reading any further. The very last question, Sean.
So there's a question here about the relationship between corruption in South Africa and South African local government, democratic election, and COVID-19 pandemic situation. Can I?
Yes, of course.
So South African citizens actively engage with the state. And I said that earlier. And because South African citizens are actively engaging with the state and how the state is governed and how leaders of the state govern the state, we cannot ignore the corruption in South African local democratic elections and COVID-19 pandemic. So I noted in particular that in the city of Johannesburg, in the past 10 days, a report came out of allegations of fraud amounting to about 80 million. So because this report has now been made public and Johannesburg citizens are now aware of these allegations of corruption within the municipality and a whole lot of other factors. And like I said, the pattern here is that we saw in 2016, where the ANC lost a huge number of their voters because of corruption. We saw in 2019, the ANC lost a significant number of voters because of corruption. So I'm assuming, and I'm making a prediction here, that based on the pattern from 2016 to 2019, there's a possibility that in 2021, the ANC might find itself in this predicament where they lose their voters purely because of corruption associated with COVID-19.
Thank you very much for that. And we definitely will see the results relatively soon. The question I want to wrap up with then is a question from Nofuhle Kunene, who asks, given that local government is so very important as a line of engagement between people and the state, and given the important role that they play in service delivery, especially, what are the existing ways that municipal councillors can be held accountable for corrupt practices and the mismanagement of state resources?
I would say that currently there isn't enough. I mean, the idea has been that because it's local government, we have direct representation, that is, you vote for the actual person. So you would imagine that the accountability will be a bit better. But I mean, that hasn't been the case. I mean, there's also independent candidates as well at the local government, but still that has not been the case. So so there isn't much accountability, if I were to say, at the local government. So one of the things that have been put forward was the recalling system. You know, if there's a way for people to kind of recall certain people that are in the list. For example, I had mentioned that 40% of the people that are voted into the local councils are from proportional representation, which is the party list. So now we are asking for a mechanism for citizens to be able to recall some of the individuals that are there. So I think those will serve as some of the mechanisms to kind of regulate who represents us in local councils. So there currently isn't any, but we're hoping for some form of recall mechanism. You know, if we are able to, if there is a certain nominations of people that they are out there, then we can say, you know what, this is not the candidate we would like to have. What is our power as citizens to kind of to say that we cannot vote for this person because of ABC? So we're looking for those kind of mechanisms to recall candidates that we feel would not do justice to our vote.
Thank you so much. So I think that brings our conversation today to a close. I want to thank both of our panelists for their time and effort. I think that you've both taught us all quite a lot about the intricacies and specificities of South Africa's electoral system, as well as lessons that we can apply in a wide variety of contexts. I also want to thank the Center for Human Rights for hosting this conversation, and encourage all of the members of the audience to join in again tomorrow, because this conference will be continuing, and it promises to continue to be just as interesting, just as engaging. Thank you all for being here. I hope that you have all enjoyed this and learned something, and I hope to see you again tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sohela.
Thank you.